This is lecture 15 of the course, The State of the United States Economy and Society. This lecture is titled The Crisis with the Environment. Our homes, our places of work, where we shop or engage in almost any activity, are linked together by a complex infrastructure network. That network requires continuous maintenance and periodic replacement. Our footprint on our planet has become heavier and heavier at an accelerating rate. We no longer have the luxury of producing without any thought about resource consumption, waste, and pollution. We have arrived at the time of reckoning. One of the great responsibilities of government is to provide the public goods and services needed to ensure a high quality of life. We are totally dependent on what nature provides to sustain ourselves and our communities. And yet there is deep debate and disagreement over the extent to which we have abrogated our responsibilities as stewards of our natural environment. Political economists of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries used the term land to take in all of the natural world, the source of the tangible wealth we produce by our labor and with increasingly sophisticated tools or capital goods. Economists, for their own reasons of analysis, decided that entrepreneurship was distinct from other forms of labor. What is most important to remember is that nature is our commons, the source of what we produce, which then rightfully belongs to the producer as private property, subject to rules of use that do not cause harm to others or to the environment. From nature comes our raw materials and wildlife, and again, the source of what we rightfully claim as our property, subject again to certain reasonable laws and restrictions on how we exploit nature and eventually dispose of what remains after our property is consumed or depreciates and loses its usefulness. As our population has spread around the globe and has increased to some 8.2 billion people from 1.6 billion people in 1900, so has the amount of material we discard every day, threatening the very commons on which we are so dependent. We have yet to come to terms with the massive amount of waste for which we must continuously find new places to accumulate. Changing how goods are produced is now reached a level of critical concern, so that we approach zero waste and near 100% reuse of materials. According to recent data, the annual output of energy from all sources globally is approximately 172 petawatt hours, which translates to around 19.6 terawatts of power generation per year, with the majority of this energy still coming from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. Natural gas remains the dominant fuel used for electricity generation in the United States, accounting for 42% of total output over the past 12 months, as shown in this chart. It has held this leading position for more than a decade. While nuclear energy share has remained relatively constant, its contribution is expected to increase meaningfully beginning in 2020 and beyond. The demonstrated reserve base of coal deposits was estimated to contain 469 billion short tons of coal. The actual proportion of coal resources that can be recovered from undisturbed deposits varies from less than 40% in some underground mines to more than 90% at some surface mines. Also, because of property rights, land use conflicts, and physical and environmental restrictions, only about 53% of these reserves may be available or accessible for mining. As of early 2026, the United States holds approximately 3,871 trillion cubic feet of technically recoverable resources of dry natural gas. This total represents the future supply available for recovery using current technology. Texas and Pennsylvania are the largest sources of what is referred to as dry natural gas, which is natural gas that is mostly methane and has had most of its liquid hydrocarbons removed in order to serve the consumer market. Although natural gas liquids and dry natural gas may be industry standards, shale gas is also equally important to drillers. Shale gas comes from a shale rock and is extracted through the fracking method. The U.S. Energy Information Administration forecasts 2026 production will average 13.5 to 13.6 million barrels per day. This represents a 0% to minus 1% change from 2025 levels, marking a significant slowdown from the 0.3 to 0.4 million barrels per day growth seen in previous years. In 2026, U.S. conventional hydropower is forecasted to provide approximately 6% of the nation's total electricity generation. While the broader U.S. power grid is experiencing record-breaking capacity additions and rising demand, hydropower's share remains relatively stable. The U.S. solar industry reached a record 43 gigawatts of new installed capacity in 2025, marking the fifth consecutive year it led all energy sources in new capacity additions. Solar and energy storage together made up 79% of all new U.S. electric capacity added, with solar accounting for roughly 54% of that total. The Solar Energy Industries Association reported in April of 2025 that there were more than 7,800 solar projects across the United States and another 1,200 major energy store projects. This photograph is of a new California installation in the Mojave Desert that has nearly 2 million solar panels and more than 120,000 batteries. In 2025, wind power in the United States generated a record 464,000 gigawatt hours of electricity, a 3% increase over 2024. Combined with solar, wind provided 17% of the nation's utility-scale generation, and when including small-scale solar, the total contribution reached 19%. The U.S. generated a record 756,621 gigawatt hours of electricity from solar and wind in 2024, enough to power the equivalent of more than 70 million average American homes. Most of the geothermal power plants in the United States are in western states and Hawaii, where geothermal energy resources are close to the Earth's surface. California generates the most electricity from geothermal energy. The Geysers Dry Steam Reservoir in Northern California is the largest known dry steam field in the world and has been producing electricity since 1960. In 2025, U.S. geothermal market report released by the Department of Energy highlights an 8% increase in installed capacity since 2020, reaching nearly 4 gigawatts. Let's take a look at resources extracted or harvested. In 2025, U.S. iron ore mine production was estimated at approximately 48 million metric tons of usable ore. This represented an increase from the 44.7 million metric tons produced in 2023. Some 90% of the remaining U.S. iron ore is found in the region around Lake Superior. U.S. gold production in 2025 was 160,000 kilograms, or 160 metric tons, according to data reported by the U.S. Geological Survey. This represents a decrease of approximately 9% from the 176,000 kilograms produced in 2024. The decline in production occurred alongside a historic surge in gold prices, which surpassed $4,000 per ounce in late 2025 and reached over $5,500 an ounce by early 2026. In 2025, U.S. lithium production remained limited as major new projects focused on construction rather than immediate output. The country produced approximately 4,000 to 5,000 metric tons of lithium in 2025. Several alternatives to lithium-ion batteries are being explored, including sodium-ion batteries, solid-state batteries, and zinc-air batteries. These technologies offer potential advantages in terms of cost, safety, and performance. In 2025, the United States produced an estimated 1 million metric tons of copper. This reflects a slight decrease from the 1.04 million metric tons produced in 2024, continuing a gradual downward trend from 1.23 million metric tons in 2022. Now let's look at food production. In 2025, there were 873,950,000 acres of land in U.S. farms, according to the USDA 2025 summary report. This represents a decrease of approximately 2,510,000 acres from 2024. However, despite the decrease in total acreage, the value of farm real estate hit record highs, averaging $4,350 per acre in 2025, a 4.3% increase from the previous year. There have been many farms that have gone out of business, sold out. Texas lost the most farms, 2,000, though its total farmland remains stable at 125 million acres. Minnesota saw a significant loss of 1,300 farms and 100,000 acres of farmland. Preliminary data and industry reports indicate that U.S. organic sales reached a record high of $71.6 billion in 2024, continuing a growth trend into 2025. Total U.S. organic acreage was approximately 7.5 million acres as of late 2025, a decline of about 1.5 million acres since 2021. The value of U.S. agricultural exports, not adjusted for inflation, peaked in fiscal year 2022 before declining in 2023. Total exports were valued at $178.7 billion in 2023, a $17 billion decrease from the previous year. Four categories typically accounted for about 90% of total agricultural exports. These categories include grains and feeds, oilseeds and products, animal, for example, livestock and poultry, meats and products, as well as horticultural products. In 2024, the United States exported $176 billion in agricultural products to 189 countries and territories. Now let's take a look at land abuse. There are more than 450,000 brownfield sites in the United States. Between 2013 and 2019, the Environmental Protection Agency awarded around 1,000 grants for cleanup of these sites for a total of almost $190 million. A 2018 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research indicated that property values in the surrounding neighborhoods rise when brownfield sites are remediated. Of course, the Environmental Protection Agency is now under the direction of an individual with very different views about the role of this agency. In 2019, there were still more than 450,000 brownfields identified across the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency estimated in 2022 that since inception of its brownfields program, only 2,100 properties have been cleaned up. What we find in almost every town, city, and other community in the United States is a large number of vacant industrial and other buildings, often surrounded by land contaminated by buried chemicals. During 2025, the EPA focused on cleaning up contaminated brownfield sites to facilitate sustainable reuse. Major cleanups were undertaken in Keokuk, Iowa, Michigan City, Indiana, San Pablo, California, and Tucson, Arizona. Cleanups have led to residential property value increases of 5% to 15.2% within a 1.29 mile radius of the sites. What about our abandoned neighborhoods? It's no secret that much of our physical infrastructure needs to be replaced. Nationally, an average 16.7% of large U.S. cities' land area is considered vacant, with approximately 4% of city addresses unoccupied. Regional variations exist in both the amount and kind of vacant land, suggesting that any ameliorative actions should be designed to fit specific conditions. Cities also reported that most vacant parcels are small, odd-shaped, and disconnected, making them difficult to redevelop. In 2025, Florida metros and Sunbelt cities continue to record some of the highest residential vacancy rates in the United States. Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Florida remains a national leader with a gross vacancy rate as high as 38.7%. Austin, Jacksonville, Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston, and Dallas all have vacancy rates between 11 and 15%. Then there are the worst case situations, such as that existing in Detroit, Michigan for decades. Within the 20 most populous cities in the United States, there are nearly 517,000 acres of developable land that remains vacant. In just two cities, Dallas and Fort Worth, there are more than 165,000 acres of vacant land. Phoenix is third with over 53,000 acres of vacant land. After Phoenix comes two other Texas cities, San Antonio, 49,000 acres, and Houston, 46,000 acres. Los Angeles is sixth with 42,000 acres of vacant land. Coast to coast, the United States is littered with diverse abandoned places, from deserted theme parks and ivy-clad mansions to industrial plants and once lavish resorts left to decay. More on the next slide. Just take a look at these properties and think what their alternative uses might be. Well, it's no secret that much of our physical infrastructure needs to be replaced. Let's take a look. While we wait for government to allocate the revenue required to maintain and rebuild the nation's infrastructure, the situation becomes more dangerous and desperate. A top priority for government spending for infrastructure affects the nation's roadways and bridges. The national highway system is essentially the lifeblood of the nation's commerce and public mobility. Although constituting only about 4% of the nation's roads, it carries more than 40% of all highway traffic, 75% of heavy truck traffic, and 90% of all tourist traffic. More than 90% of all U.S. residents live within 5 miles of this network. Roughly 4.3 million miles of roads and highways crisscross the United States. Total U.S. government funding for highways in 2025 is estimated at approximately $243.4 billion, representing a 6.5% increase driven by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In 2025, U.S. spending on highway and street construction remains strong, driven by public infrastructure investment, with total state and local expenditures reaching approximately $140 to $140 billion, up from $137 billion in 2023. In 2025, U.S. bridge construction and repair activity has grown, with state and local governments awarding $33.5 billion in contracts through March, an 11.7% increase over early 2024. Supported by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this spending aims to address a backlog where roughly 6.7% of U.S. bridges, some 42,000, are considered in poor condition. Bridges are susceptible to damage and deterioration from a variety of causes. In 1968, a U.S. Navy training aircraft crashed into the eastern side of the Oakland Bay Bridge, causing considerable damage. Then in 1989, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake caused a 50-foot section of the upper deck to collapse on the lower deck. The bridge had to be closed for over a month. The photograph in the upper left is of the 2007 collapse of a major bridge in Minnesota. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore occurred in March 2024. For fiscal year 2025, the U.S. Highway Trust Fund continued to face a significant structural deficit, with projected spending far outpacing dedicated tax revenues from the federal gas tax. The Highway Trust Fund is expected to spend approximately $213 billion more than it collects between 2025 and 2030. And then there is our water and sewer systems, many of which are quite old. Cumulative local expenditures for both water and sewer utility infrastructure and operations from 1993 to 2020 reached a total of $2.53 trillion. Total sewer utility expenditures were $1.1 trillion, and total water utility expenditures were $1.4 trillion. An Environmental Protection Agency study released in September of 2024 stated that water system upgrades could cost more than $1 trillion over the next 20 years. Every community of any size has the challenges of securing adequate sources of water, installing and maintaining pumping systems to carry water to and from all properties, and treating wastewater to a high level of purity for reuse. For much of the history of the country, our rivers, lakes, and streams have been used for the dumping of toxic chemicals as well as human and animal wastes. Nature does its best to rid the toxins over time, but is overwhelmed by our continued abuse of this essential natural resource. An analysis of drinking water quality by the nonprofit Environmental Working Group found that unsafe levels of harmful chemicals existed in many parts of the country. The greatest exposure was found near urban areas and potential chemical sources, with high counts in the Great Plains, Great Lakes, Eastern Seaboard, and center to southern California. Many of America's critical sources of underground water are in a state of rapid and accelerating decline. More than half of the aquifers in the United States, 53%, are losing water, according to research published in Nature. States with limited water resources but experiencing rapid increases in population face the most difficult challenges. The state of Arizona is now attempting to negotiate an agreement with Mexico to permit construction of desalination plants drawing water from the Gulf of California to be piped across Mexico and up the mountains to Phoenix. And we have the continued problem of what to do about plastics. Plastics are everywhere. Concern over the quality of tap water continues to serve as a primary reason for the consumption of bottled water, despite the huge quantity of plastic waste that must be recycled or disposed of. The irony is that nearly half of all bottled water is sourced from the municipal water supply, then purified. Average U.S. consumption per person has increased each year from 42.3 gallons in 2018 to 47.3 gallons in 2024. In addition to the plastic waste created, studies of bottled water quality carried out in Europe found chemicals in the water leached from the plastic bottles, from the lids, and from contamination of the wells from which the water is drawn. For the first half of 2025, the U.S. maintained a narrow trade surplus in recyclable plastic materials, though it has decreased by 78% compared to the previous year. Canada and Mexico account for 67.3% of total U.S. plastic scrap import quantity. Millions of marine animals are killed by plastics every year. Marine species of all sizes, from zooplankton to whales, consume microplastics. Ocean currents pull small plastic particles from Asia all the way to Hawaii's Big Island. Ramani Narayan, a chemical engineering professor at Michigan State University, puts the scale of the problem in its proper context. Let's say you recycle 100% in all of North America and Europe. You still would not make a dent on the plastics released into the oceans. If you want to do something about this, you have to go there, to these countries, and deal with the mismanaged waste. Now let's take a look at commuter rail systems. The age distribution of U.S. rail vehicles shows great disparities. Many are 15 or fewer years old, while more than 2,000 have been in service for 40 years or more. For the 2025 fiscal year, the U.S. federal government allocated $20.9 billion to public transit systems. This represents a 0.4% increase, or $82 million, over 2024 funding levels. The cost to bring all U.S. transit assets into a state of good repair is estimated at $140.2 billion, with rail systems, guideways, and stations making up the largest share of the repair cost. In 2025, public transportation is a $93.4 billion industry in the United States, according to the American Public Transportation Association. The industry directly employs over 430,000 workers. For fiscal year 2025, U.S. spending on intercity passenger rail is characterized by record-level capital investments from Amtrak and a total federal allocation of approximately $16.2 billion for passenger and freight rail programs. So, what effect does infrastructure spending have on land values? Let's take a look. What brings people to a community is the opportunity to secure employment, the opportunity to secure a decent and affordable home, and the opportunity to enjoy amenities provided by the public and private sectors. The quality of these amenities is directly related to public expenditure and to how the revenue is raised to meet the expenses incurred. The planning community has in recent years awakened to the significant, often enormous increase in land values caused by the extension of public transit systems into new areas and by the improvement of existing transit hubs. The concept of transit-oriented development is embraced as a needed response to sprawling development and continued dependency on use of the automobile for commuting between home and work. This has stimulated discussion of whether and how to capture these increased land values to offset the cost of the public transit systems. Rick Rybeck, a city planner and director of the firm Just Economics, based in Washington, D.C., supports restructuring the conventional property tax in order to efficiently capture the increases in land value associated with public infrastructure investments. He writes, "Surprisingly, the higher tax on land helps keep land prices more affordable. It reduces the profit from land speculation, thereby reducing the speculative demand for land. Returning infrastructure-created land values to the public helps make infrastructure financially self-sustaining, at least to a greater degree than today, and thereby reduces the need for other taxes and subsidies. It also creates some fairness in infrastructure funding because landowners who benefit from infrastructure end up paying in proportion to the benefits that they receive. Now let's take a look at the condition of our lakes, rivers, and streams. Federal and state laws prohibiting the discharge of toxins into U.S. waters are fundamentally strong in design, centered on the Clean Water Act of 1972. But their effectiveness is often limited by enforcement challenges, legal loopholes, and emerging contaminants. The Clean Water Act makes it unlawful to discharge pollutants from a point source, like a pipe, into navigable waters without a permit, a structure that has successfully prevented billions of pounds of toxic waste from entering waters. But there are problems. The Supreme Court has significantly narrowed federal protections for wetlands and streams under the Clean Water Act, limiting jurisdiction to wetlands with a continuous surface connection to traditional navigable waters. This ruling removes federal oversight for many adjacent wetlands, impacting an estimated 63% of U.S. wetlands and many ephemeral streams. A 2022 General Accounting Office report noted that in 2018, nearly 11,000 facilities significantly exceeded their permit limits and illegally discharged pollutants. Many cities have antiquated systems that discharge untreated sewage into water bodies during heavy rainfall. Back in 2020, algae covered the Copco Reservoir in Northern California. This occurs frequently because nutrients become trapped in the warmer water of the reservoirs, creating an ideal breeding ground for blooms of algae. When algae start to take over, they reduce oxygen levels and can block sunlight. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, making it easy for levels to drop quickly in the summer, causing harm to fish and reducing overall water quality. One of the most effective tools for algae prevention is UV filtration. When algae cells are exposed to UV light as they pass through clarifiers, their cells are weakened, preventing growth, and can then be filtered out. Adding a UV pond clarifier or a pressurized UV pond filter to a pond in the spring or early summer is an effective way to combat algae. More extensive measures are required to prevent an algae bloom in a reservoir or lake. These include a vegetative buffer, prevention of fertilizer runoff into the water body, prevention of wastewater leaking into the groundwater or nearby surface water, and keeping pets and livestock away from the water's edge. About 70% of the Earth's surface water supplies are contaminated by runoff from fertilizers, pesticides, and animal waste from farms and livestock operations that produce pathogens. Nutrient pollution caused by excess nitrogen and phosphorus in water or air is the #1 threat to water quality worldwide. 16 states reported illnesses from toxic algae in 2021. In 2025, harmful algae blooms continue to pose significant health risks across the United States. While many symptoms are acute and resolved with treatment, emerging research in 2025 has increasingly linked long-term exposure to chronic conditions. More than likely, the Trump administration and the EPA will grant permission to oil drillers to discharge wastewater directly into rivers and streams. This wastewater contains huge amounts of salt, heavy metals, and other chemicals. The Supreme Court rejected a narrow view of the Clean Water Act, indicating that discharging pollution into groundwater that connects to navigable waters is still subject to federal regulation. And now let's take a look at natural gas. Natural gas production is continuing to increase, driven by record high output in the United States and growing global demand, especially for liquefied natural gas. U.S. production is expected to set a new record in 2026, with further increases projected into 2027. The Union of Concerned Scientists puts the advantages of natural gas over oil in a balanced context. Natural gas emits 50 to 60% less carbon dioxide when combusted in a new efficient natural gas power plant compared with emissions from a typical new coal plant. Considering only tailpipe emissions, natural gas also emits 15 to 20% less heat-trapping gases than gasoline when burned in today's typical vehicle. Emissions from smokestacks and tailpipes, however, do not tell the full story. The drilling and extraction of natural gas from wells and its transportation in pipelines results in the leakage of methane, primary component of natural gas that is 34 times stronger than CO2 at trapping heat over a 100-year period, and 86 times stronger over 20 years. Preliminary studies and field measurements show that these so-called fugitive methane emissions range from 1 to 9% of total life cycle emissions. Whether natural gas has lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than coal and oil depends on the assumed leakage rate, the global warming potential of methane over different time frames, the energy conversion efficiency, and other factors. The pipelines through which natural gas is distributed need to be replaced in many parts of the country. A 2013 report released by the U.S. Senate found that gas distribution companies in 2011 reported releasing 69 billion cubic feet of natural gas to the atmosphere, almost enough to meet the state of Maine's gas need for a year. Replacing old pipes is a top priority to stop leaks that release methane, a potent greenhouse gas, and to prevent safety hazards like explosions. The Trump administration announced this March the allocation of $98 million to replace aging pipelines, $1 billion over 5 years. This graph shows the distribution of the age of the pipelines. One analyst, Chris Dalby of the energy company ENI, succinctly describes the scale of the problem. An issue that has overcome much of the goodwill toward fixing energy infrastructure is the sheer scale of the problem. Given the interconnection of pipes, pipelines, and transmission lines across state lines, under lakes and rivers, and through deserts, tracking where the most serious issues lie is arduous at best. According to current estimates, around 1% of total natural gas production in the United States is leaked into the atmosphere, though some studies suggest this figure could be significantly higher, reaching up to 3% or more depending upon the region and source of data. This leaked gas is primarily methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Well then, is the air safe to breathe? Measured by particulate pollution, the quality of air in the United States ranks 10th in the world. Microscopic pollution is a byproduct of burning and commonly comes from power plants, automobile and truck exhaust, and wildfires. New research from the nonprofit First Street Foundation finds that climate change is increasing the prevalence of two of the air pollutants most harmful to human health, particulate matter and tropospheric ozone. California's number of days with hazardous air quality has increased by more than 1,100% since 2000. Many parts of the West have seen an increase of nearly 500% since the year 2000. A major source of air pollutants is the power plants that generate the electricity we rely on. A report by the Clean Air Task Force found that about 7,500 deaths each year are attributable to fine particle pollution from U.S. power plants. U.S. energy-related emissions in 2025 rose by an estimated 2.4%, driven by increased coal power for rising electricity demand and higher building heating needs. Key sectors showed mixed trends. Power and building emissions increased, while transportation emissions saw a slight decline. And so that deals with some of our environmental issues. Solutions, not so much. So what's next? Next, at the core of our challenges as a society are what the author Ferdinand Lundberg described as cracks in the Constitution. We'll look at these issues next.